England exists because one man refused to stay dead, and because Vikings chose trade over fire at just the right moment. That sounds dramatic, and it should be, because this story begins at the edge of despair. There was no England yet, no single crown, no unified people, no shared future, only fragments. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia made up a land like patches of a quilt, all with unique, small, little kingdoms stitched together with fear and blood. And most of those stitches were coming undone. The Vikings, they were no longer operating exclusively through lightning raids on the coast. They changed tactics. They were expanding. What started as wintering in a more temperate climate led to farming, building, marrying, having family, and ultimately staying. This wasn't a temporary storm that was passing along the coast of England. This was becoming the very fabric of the landscape. Churches burned, kings and kingdoms crumbled, armies were decimated or scattered. England was being swallowed slowly, deliberately, and completely. And by the year 878, the map, it was almost rewritten. 3 kingdoms had vanished, and the last one was barely breathing. England was one battle away from extinction. Pause there and let that settle in for a moment. Because the man standing between England and oblivion wasn't a conquering hero on a war horse. He wasn't a roaring speaker or the front man of any shield wall. He was sick, he was hunted, and he was exhausted. In fact, the Danes thought they had rid themselves of this king. They were feasting in his halls and boasting of defeat and that the final king of the final kingdom had fallen. They assumed that this feeble king had retreated to die alone in the swamps on the edge of his borders, but that assumption is exactly why England survives. Because sometimes the world is saved not by a man who looks the strongest, but by the one everyone thought was dead, who returns from the ashes to save his people. While everyone had already concluded that Wessex and the dream of a future united kingdom were lost, Alfred refused to disappear. Before he was a king, Alfred the Great was something far less impressive and far more important. He was a younger son, an observer, a man raised in the long shadow of a stronger, older brother. He never was meant to wear the crown, never trained to carry the full weight of a collapsing kingdom. And that matters because Alfred didn't inherit a throne at its peak, he inherited the aftermath. By the time Alfred steps onto the stage of history, the Viking Age was no longer a series of fast coastal strikes followed by quick escapes. The Northmen, they had adapted. The Danes had adapted. What arrived in England in the mid-9th centuries was not a raid, it was relocation. The Great Heathen Army was not an army in the modern sense. It was families, leaders, craftsmen, traders, warriors. It was land full of livestock and ships loaded with weapons and furs and intentions. These people were looking for land, stability, opportunity, and a future. This wasn't a strategy of war and wealth grabbing, but new beginnings and a chance at a better life. Northumbria fell first. Fractured by internal rivalries as a result of disunity, they were unable to respond as a single force. East Anglia followed, its king was killed, its lands absorbed. Mercia didn't so much fall as it unraveled. It could no longer resist the presence of the Danes. One by one, the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, they folded into a new reality shaped by Scandinavian law, Scandinavian settlements, and a Scandinavian way of life. And standing at the far south edge of that island was Wessex, the last wall still standing between history as we know it and something we can only imagine could have been. This wasn't Viking versus England. This was Viking versus the idea of England. because England as a unified nation didn't exist yet. What existed was the possibility of it. It was fragile, unproven, and easy to erase. The Danes weren't villains in this story. They were doing what successful people have always done in history, moving forward, expanding their land, expanding trade routes, security, and influence. They negotiated when it made sense, they fought when it didn't. They settled where they could, and in many places they improved agriculture, expanded commerce, and built towns that would outlast the war itself. But from Alfred's perspective, the pressure was relentless. He inherited a kingdom already at war, already exhausted, continuing to shrink. And he inherited it while his own body was failing him. Alfred was chronically ill. Ancient sources describe severe abdominal pain, sudden weakness, long periods of suffering. Modern historians often point to something like Crohn's disease. Whatever the diagnosis, the reality was this: Alfred ruled in pain. He fought in pain. He planned, negotiated, and endured through pain. He was also young and inexperienced when he took the throne. He had no long apprenticeship, no gradual transition. One moment he was a supporting figure in his brother's reign, and the next he was responsible for the survival of an entire nation. And the odds were not in his favor. The Viking armies, they were seasoned, mobile, and confident. They had momentum. They had success behind them. And increasingly, they had little reason to believe that Wessex would be any different than the fall of the other kingdoms. Then it happens. At one point, Alfred doesn't just lose a battle. He loses his kingdom. His forces collapse. His allies scatter. The Danes occupy Wessex as if the matter were settled. Alfred disappears from the record, presumed defeated, irrelevant, and altogether finished. And England seems to vanish with him. And yet, this is not the end of the story. We travel to the marshland in southern England. The marsh, it was not a hospitable place. It has a tendency to swallow anyone or anything not designed to live in its harsh conditions. There is water everywhere and nowhere all at once. The air is always cool and forever damp. There is no warmth there. It's a place where solid ground is a suggestion rather than a promise. This is where Alfred goes. If the world thought that he was finished, the marsh would surely seal his fate. But instead, we have a history of the ultimate comeback story. The thing about this low island of mud and water was it was reachable only by narrow paths, known typically only by the locals and completely lost to outsiders. Here, Alfred is no longer wearing a crown. No banners follow him, no horns announce his presence. He moves with a small group of loyal men who had lost everything too, but remained faithful to their king. They slept on damp ground. They ate what they could trap. They listened and pondered more than they spoke. At night, the marsh is loud. Frogs call. The water shifts. Insects by the millions make for an unforgettable chorus of sound. The mist and fog roll in, steady, slow, like something alive. Alfred, he would lie awake, with dull pain in his gut. But his mind was awake and sharper than any blade. He knew that somewhere beyond the reeds, heathen fires burnt warm and steady in his palace. And in his halls echo voices that were not English. The Danes believed the war was over, and rightfully so. Kings don't usually survive this type of situation, let alone mount a comeback for the history books. One day, Alfred, he left the marsh alone, hood drawn low, moving as a man without a name or a rank. He came to a small cottage. Smoke curled from the roof. A woman stands over a hearth, hands busy, eyes tired. She looks at him, not as a king, but as another hungry stranger. She tells him, "Watch the cakes." Alfred nodded. He sat near the fire. The warmth soaks into him. For a moment, he forgets the marsh. For a moment, he forgets the weight of everything he has lost. And the cakes, they burned. The woman returned furious. She scolds him sharply, calls him useless, lazy, a man good for nothing, standing near warmth while others do all the work. Alfred takes the words. He doesn't correct her. He accepts the rebuke like he earned it. But it was at that moment that Alfred received clarity. The King of England couldn't even be helpful in a kitchen. How could he expect to manage an entire kingdom? Because of this brief session in Alfred's life, he was able to see something he never would have otherwise. He sees how ordinary people live, what they fear, what they endure, what stability actually means when you have no army to hide behind. In the marsh, Alfred became something new and more dangerous than he had been before. He begins to listen to others, but also to the honest feedback of his memories. He learned lessons from his past failures. He accepted responsibility and he refused to stay broken. And so he planned and began to strategize. Having learned from every slight, every loss, every mistake, he learned from the hardship he was currently experiencing. This is where the script has been flipped. You see, Alfred now resides in the harsh conditions. He's learning lessons that only pain can produce. He realizes that to rise and fight, to hope for a better future, is all he has because the marsh is not a long-term solution. The Vikings, they are feasting in halls. They are drinking. They are settled. They have what they need and they begin to be satisfied. And worst of all, they think the war is over. They had come from harsh conditions. They looked to new lands, to warmer climates with hope. They fought because what else was there to do? They had learned lessons that only the harsh conditions of the frozen north could teach them. The land had prepared them for war more than they knew. They were always ready for a battle, and that made them extremely dangerous. But it doesn't take long for comfort to rob a person or a group of people of their edge and their ability to be effective in battle. In water and reed, where the lone heron stands, a crownless king learns the weight of the land. No throne, no hall, no cheering men, just failure and pain and a miserable end. From water and reed, the lone heron parts. The fire still burns in a humble heart. No crown, no song, only wounds to mend. Yet from these ruins a king will ascend. Every great leader has a moment where history almost forgets them. For Alfred the Great, that was the marsh, and was all because of one man, Guthrum. Guthrum was not a villain stroking his long Nordic beard. He was a commander who had much success, was extremely disciplined, and had men who were extremely confident. That confidence came because they won. He represented the new Viking reality in England, organized, strategic, patient. A man who understands not just how to fight for land, but how to keep it. And when Alfred faced him, Alfred lost, and he lost decisively. The Danish forces broke Wessex resistance and spread across the countryside. Towns had no choice but to open their gates. Farmers adapted, trade continued. Life went on, just under new management. The Danes controlled most of England, and Alfred, he was left with nothing. And for months, the world thought Alfred was gone while he was hiding out in the swamp. Guthrum and his men held the land. They camped in English towns. They continued to plan their future. But Alfred was still alive. He stepped out of the marsh quietly, not like a hero, not yet. There was no guarantee that Alfred would succeed. But at this point, he had nothing to lose. Messengers quietly went out across the countryside, and one by one, word spread. The king lives. Farmers left their fields. Young men packed up shields that they hadn't lifted in months. Old warriors prepared their leather armor and prepared to liberate the land or die trying. This was not a huge army, but it was enough. Alfred didn't rush. He gathered his men carefully. He chose where to fight. He led them to the high ground outside of Edington. If this battle were lost, there would be no retreat left. No hiding place, no marsh to save him or his men. This was it. Guthrum did not expect what he faced. He thought Alfred was weak. He thought the English would break like before. When the two armies met, the Danish warriors were confident. They had won before and could not envision a different outcome this time. Then their shields met. Weapons crashed. Wood slammed into wood. Men pushed forward step by step. The fight was slow and brutal. No fancy moves, just strength, grit, and every muscle burning from fatigue and fighting to survive. And this time, it was the English lines that didn't break. They held, they pushed, and slowly something unbelievable happened. Guthrum retreated. The Danes fled to their camp. Alfred followed and surrounded them. The Danes were trapped. Days passed. Food ran out. Hope faded. And then Alfred did the unthinkable. Instead of killing his enemy, he offered peace. Not because he was weak or afraid, but because he had a vision of England. He was building a future. England wasn't born from the strength of its weapons, but it was forged in mercy and wisdom. Here's the part of the story that most people never hear. The Vikings, they weren't completely alien. They didn't arrive speaking an incomprehensible tongue or living by rules that no one could understand. In fact, if you dropped an English farmer and a Danish trader in the same market, they could do business, and they could do it with relative ease. Old English and Old Norse, they're cousins. Shared Germanic roots, similar sentence rhythms, familiar words, and most of the time, they didn't need translators to bargain over wool and silver. They just spoke a little slower, listened a little harder, and met somewhere in the middle. If you speak English, you already speak the language of the Viking world. Words like sky, window, law, knife, husband, anger, take, get. These words and more, they arrived with Scandinavian settlers and stayed because they worked, which means the real war was sparked by something else entirely. It's interesting to note that life, it tends to happen very naturally when people live side by side long enough. Markets became meeting places, ports became towns, camps became communities. The Vikings didn't just fight on English soil. They slowly started to sound like the locals, live like them, and become the locals. This matters because it reframes the entire conflict. What Alfred faced was not a foreign horde bent on annihilation. It was a parallel society taking roots inside his world. The biggest problem the Anglo-Saxons faced was that their belief system was more foreign than the people themselves. That is why they were called heathens before they came to be known as Vikings. They had their own religious beliefs, laws, customs, and way of viewing the world. While Alfred envisioned a united England, the biggest hurdle was always fragmented beliefs. Now you introduce something in direct opposition to his Christian faith. But Alfred was more than a survivor. He was a student, and he studied the Danes. He studied the heathens. He came to be familiar with what they believed. He also noticed how the Danes traded, moved goods efficiently through river towns. He commended them on what he could, and he interacted peacefully with many traders. He understood how Scandinavian law valued clarity, compensation, and public accountability. For that, he commended them as well. Things that he could see as common ground, he used to bridge the gap and introduce them to his faith. Instead of trying to ease that world, Alfred, he builds a framework that can contain it. And all that is left is their conversion to Christianity. Trade towns flourished under negotiated peace. Markets stabilized, coins began to circulate again. Law stopped being whatever the strongest man says, and it starts being something written, remembered, and enforced. Out of this shared space emerges the Danelaw. Not a surrender, not a victory, but a compromise carved into the landscape itself. Viking law beside English law, Scandinavian customs beside Saxon ones, and a border not just of land, but of ideas. Alfred won militarily at Edington, but he didn't try to impose total domination afterwards. The Danes retained territory, leadership, and identity. Alfred returned to Wessex and to the building of a framework for a future England. England doesn't survive by defeating the Vikings outright. It survives by absorbing what works, rejecting what doesn't, and shaping something new from the overlap. And so, a nation begins to form, not in spite of the Vikings, but partially because of them. That is the kind of history they don't teach you. History loves battles. It remembers the clash of shields, the turning of lines, the names of blood-soaked locations. But the moment that actually changed everything was once the fighting stopped, quietly and deliberately. See, after Edington, Guthrum was not dragged in chains before Alfred the Great. There was no public execution, not in the physical sense, no revenge dressed up as justice, no ritual humiliation to satisfy wounded pride. Instead, Alfred does something no one expected. He stands before Guthrum with an invitation to bow, not to bow before himself, but to bow before the God of the Bible. Guthrum bowed, and Guthrum was baptized. He took on a new name, Athelstan, a name rooted in the land he once fought over, a name that says, I have now sworn allegiance to a kingdom not of this world, and I will forever be a part of this land, but in seeing it grow in unity, not in rivalry. Most historians treat Guthrum's baptism like a footnote. It isn't. It's the hinge on which England turns from a battlefield into a nation. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Because empires fall by the sword, but civilizations are built by what happens after the swords are lowered. History could have been very different if Alfred hadn't survived, or if Guthrum and his army were executed. But what would have been in either case? Would the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes have made peace at some point? Would it have been peace based on common belief in Odin and Thor? I would love to hear your thoughts and your comments. Discussions that follow episodes like these are one of the best parts for me, to be able to read your thoughts in your comments. So I appreciate it when you do that. I appreciate everyone who has commented and invited others into the conversation. Now, the borders were drawn, laws were recognized, and authority was clarified. The Danes were not driven into the sea or kicked out of the land. They were acknowledged as rulers of their own lands under shared expectations. Life continues. This was not weakness, this was the vision, and that was the wisdom of Alfred. Alfred's comeback story had a vital victory that changed the course of history, but he didn't defeat the Vikings. He led them, and they helped him fulfill his vision of England. This is what lies at the foundation for English identity, not as something pure and sealed off, but as something forged at a crossroads of cultures, Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian, land-bound and seafaring, rooted and mobile. It defines Christian kingship not as domination, but as responsibility, power used to restrain violence, not inflame it. Authority was expressed through law and order rather than blood feud. These moments, they still ripple through history, and we experience them whether we realize it or not. Vikings helped shape England's legal customs too. Public assemblies, clear compensation for wrongs, law as something spoken, remembered, and enforced communally. The DNA of the Vikings runs straight through what becomes English common law. This was a pivotal time in history, and the impact that the Danes had on the world we know today goes way beyond what this episode has time to discuss. Alfred is the only English king officially remembered as the Great. Alfred the Great. Not Henry, not Edward, not even the latter empire builders, just Alfred. Not because he conquered the most land, but because he saved the idea of England when it was barely an idea at all. And the Viking story, it doesn't end there, not even close. What happened in England can be seen in other countries as well, most notably the Northmen who landed in France or Francia. Those Scandinavian settlers, they became Normans. I'm looking forward to that episode more than you know, partially because it introduces one of the most famous Normans of all, William the Conqueror, and he's going to connect Normandy with his post-Alfred England. But then again, there's already a connection, because William the Conqueror married Matilda of Flanders, who was a direct descendant of Alfred the Great, which means that the English and Danish, along with the Norwegians who settled in France, are all connected and have all had their impact on the Western world. People often ask, what happened to the Norsemen of the Viking Age? Well, they didn't disappear, they merged, and they created new identities. So when people imagine Vikings as defeated or vanishing, they're missing the point entirely. They didn't vanish. They adapted, they settled, they ruled, and the Viking Age didn't end as much as it transformed. And once you realize that, England's story stops being about winners and losers and starts being about what one can become when they lay down the desire to dominate and look to what they can build together in unity. The future hinged on a handful of fragile decisions, on a sick man choosing not to quit, on a fugitive king choosing patience over pride, on one moment in a swamp where giving up would have been reasonable, understandable, and even logical. If Alfred the Great had died in the reeds, if he had been caught or surrendered or simply disappeared quietly into history, the world would look very different. Alfred teaches us something history rarely emphasizes. You don't survive or even reach your full potential by being the strongest or never facing adversity. You move from surviving to thriving by adapting, learning from failure, getting up when life knocks you down, and having the humility to start again. Life can change quickly, from comfort to confrontation. When the old structures don't hold anymore, when the ground beneath you feels unreliable, when you look around and realize you're outnumbered, not just physically, but ideologically, emotionally, and spiritually. Sometimes it feels like you're hiding in the marshes of life, off the map, out of step, assumed by others that you are finished. Alfred reminds us that retreat is not always failure. Sometimes retreat is recovery. Sometimes it's the quiet work of rethinking everything. Failure, when used correctly, doesn't weaken a person. It tempers them like a Viking blade. It sharpens judgment. It strips away illusion and leaves only what actually matters. And when you re-engage, when you step into the light, you do so wiser, steadier, and much harder to break. Alfred didn't win because he crushed his enemies. He won because he knew when to fight, he never gave up, and he knew that he was looking to build something that could outlast any temporary war. That's the kind of victory that echoes. That's the kind of victory we still feel today. And if there's one thing that this story proves, it's this. History is not shaped by those who never fall. It's shaped by those who refuse to stay down. I can guarantee you that there is someone that you know who needs to hear this. Remember, England didn't begin with victory. It began with a man who refused to disappear. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that retreat is not defeat, that wisdom can outlast the sword, and that resilience shapes history more than rage ever could, definitely share this episode with somebody that you know that needs to hear this message. Remember, England didn't begin with victory. It began with a man who refused to disappear. So if you've enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to make sure you subscribe, like, comment, share, do all those things that you know help the algorithm, boost this podcast in the ratings so that others can find it, so this community can grow, and so that we can continue to bring you amazing Norse lore, history, legends, all that stuff. So thank you again for being part of this, and until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.